In this lecture, you will learn about the Southern colonies in the 17th century, the Bacon's Rebellion, and slavery.
In 1622, at the dawn of the tobacco boom, Jamestown was still seen as a failure. The rise of tobacco and the destruction of the Powhatan turned the tide. After the destruction of the Powhatans, the colonists escaped the deadly peninsula and moved inland. Immigrants poured into the colony to grow tobacco and turn a profit for the crown. The Chesapeake region, which constitute Virginia and Maryland, will become the most populated region during the 17th century. As more settlers continue to come, we will have other colonies. We will then have North Carolina and South Carolina, and later in the 18th century, Georgia. These colonies constitute the southern colonies, and like Virginia, tobacco and other cash crops will play a major role on their development. Tobacco was a demanding crop that required close attention and a great deal of hand labor year-round. Primitive tools and methods made this intensive cycle of labor particularly taxing. The English colonists worked hard because their labor promised greater rewards in the Chesapeake region than in England. Powerful incentives to immigrate to Virginia, combined with the colonists' desperate need for labor, soon created a servant labor system, and about 80% of the immigrants to Virginia during the 17th century were indentured servants. The first known Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, and a few more slaves trickled into the Chesapeake region during the next several decades. Nevertheless, the preferred form of labor by planters in the 17th century was indentured servants. The majority of indentured servants were white immigrants from England. To immigrate to the colonies, they borrowed the cost of transportation from a merchant or a ship captain in England who sold the contract to a tobacco planter in North America. The servants agreed to work for 4 to 7 years to repay the loan. When the servant survived his term of indenture, the system allowed for planters to reap handsome profits and promise poor immigrants freedom in a land of promise. Indentured servants were overwhelmingly male, young and unskilled. Women and skilled craftsmen were rare in Virginia. Planters devised severe laws to keep servants in their place and to extend the terms of indenture. Women servants were subject to special restrictions and risk and were prohibited from marrying during their indenture. Indentured women who gave birth to a child had to serve 2 extra years and pay a fine. The fundamental realities of the servant labor system were that planters' hunger for labor caused them to demand as much labor as they could get from their servants. Servants hoped to survive their servitude and use their freedom to obtain land and start a family. Servants often made grudging workers because they view themselves as free people in a temporary status of servitude, and planters put up with this contentious arrangement because the alternatives were less desirable. Planters could not easily hire free men and women because land was abundant, and free people preferred to work on their own land for themselves. When it pertains to religion, vast acres of wilderness, interrupted by tobacco farms, characterize the Chesapeake landscape. A settled region does resemble a lacework of farms stitched around waterways. Most Chesapeake colonists were Protestants, but were not as religious as their New England counterparts that we will discuss later. As the 17th century continues, we will see the growth of social and economic polarization in the Chesapeake southern colonies. A hierarchy of sorts will emerge. During the first half of the 17th century, the principal divisions in the Chesapeake society was between free yeoman farmers and unfree servants. But then we will see divisions widen. Plantation owners will be at the very top, then small farmers. These were indentured servants that survived their servitude. Then the indentured servants, and finally slaves. Although at the beginning of the century one can argue that the distinctions between the planters and the farmers was not as much, we will see that divisions grow between the top two groups as we move forward. Three major developments that will splinter the equality among free men during the third quarter of the century will be oversupply of tobacco lowered the tobacco prices in Europe, and more servants survived their indentures, leading to a larger and more discontented group of landless freemen. And a declining mortality rate allowed long-time farmers to compound their successes and encourage the formation of a planter elite. By the 1670s, the society of the Chesapeake had become divided between the planters, both elite and yeomen, and the landless colonists. Moreover, the crown began to gain more control over the colonies. The king tightened the royal government's control of trade and collected substantial revenue from the Chesapeake by passing a series of navigation acts between 1650 and 1660, which, among other things, required the colonists to trade exclusively with England and levied an import duty on tobacco. When it pertained to politics in the Chesapeake, in general, the government enforced the distinctions separating servants and masters in the Chesapeake society with an iron fist. As discontent mounted among the poor during the 1660s and 1670s, colonial officials tried to keep political power in safe hands by suspending elections for the House of Burgesses and by outlawing voting for poor men. With discontent between the poorer classes and the planters in the Chesapeake mounting, the conflicts in the western frontier between farmers and the surviving natives will continue. Native American communities in Virginia had already been decimated by the wars in 1622 and 1644. But the number of land-hungry colonists continued to multiply, encroaching on Indian lands and creating a frontier of sorts. Small conflicts between frontier settlers and the Indians continued to flare. The conflict known as Bacon's Rebellion grew out of tensions between Native Americans and English settlers, as well as tensions between wealthy English landowners and poor settlers who continually pushed west into Indian territory. Bacon's Rebellion began, appropriately enough, with an argument over a pig. In the summer of 1675, a group of Doing Indians visited Thomas Matthew on his plantation in northern Virginia to collect a debt that he owed them. When Matthew refused to pay, they took some of his pigs to settle the debt. The theft sparked a series of raids and counter-raids. A militia of 1,000 men created a war party. For 6 weeks, they raided a tribe of Indians who had nothing to do in the conflict. Panicked colonists fled en masse from vulnerable frontiers, flooding into coastal communities and begging the government for help. The governor at the time was William Berkeley. The cautious governor did not send an army after the natives. He worried that a full-scale war would inevitably drag other Indians into the conflict, turning allies into deadly enemies. Berkeley therefore insisted on a defensive strategy centered on a string of new fortifications to protect the frontier and strict instructions not to antagonize friendly Indians. It was a sound military policy, but a public relations disaster. Terrified colonists condemned Berkeley. Building contracts for the forts went to Berkeley's wealthy friends, who conveniently decided that their own plantations were the most strategically vital. Colonists denounced the government as a corrupt band of oligarchs more interested in lining their pockets than protecting the people. By the spring of 1676, a small group of frontier colonists took matters into their own hands. Naming the charismatic young native Bacon as their leader, Bacon charged the elite with operating the government for their private gain. Ironically, he was quite rich himself. Bacon then led an all-out war on all Indians whatsoever and massacred friendly Okochaniches. Bacon's followers also assured Berkeley that they intend no disloyalty, but Berkeley feared a coup and branded the volunteers as traitors. Berkeley finally mobilized an army not to pressure the natives, but to crush the colonists' rebellion. Governor Berkeley then branded Bacon as a traitor, prompting Bacon and his followers to declare war on the governor and the elite. Berkeley soon had Bacon arrested and forced the rebel leader into the humiliating position of publicly begging forgiveness for his treason. Bacon swallowed his dignity, but turned the tables by gathering an army of followers upon his release and surrounding the State House, demanding that Berkeley name him the General of Virginia and bless his universal war against the Indians. Instead, the 70-year-old governor stepped into the field in front of the crowd of angry men, unafraid, and called Bacon a traitor to his face. Then he tore open his shirt and dared Bacon to shoot him in the heart if he was so intent to overthrowing his government. "Here," he shouted before the crowd, "shoot me before God. It is a fair mark. Shoot." When Bacon hesitated, Berkeley drew his sword and challenged the young man to a duel, knowing that Bacon could neither back down from the challenge without looking like a coward, nor kill him without making himself into a villain. After the showdown, the rebels marched to Jamestown and were successful at ousting the political elite and put in power local leaders in the House of Burgesses. The new legislature passed a series of reform measures known as Bacon's Laws that favor small planters and the frontier settlers. However, Bacon's rebellion quickly spiraled out of control, and Berkeley slowly rebuilt his loyalist army. After 3 months of fighting, Bacon died of typhus in the autumn of 1676, and his successors surrendered to Berkeley in January of 1777. Soon Berkeley tried and executed the rebel leadership. Before long, however, the royal fleet arrived, bearing over 1,000 red-coated troops and a royal commission of investigation charged with restoring order to the colony. The commissioners replaced the governor and dispatched Berkeley to London, where he died in disgrace. In the aftermath of the rebellion, tensions lessened between the planters and small farmers, in part because the elite recognized that it was safer for the colonists to fight Indians rather than each other, and the government made little effort to restrict settlers' encroachment on Indian land. The Bacon's rebellion proved that perhaps the indentured servant system was beginning to fail, as more indentured servants were surviving their indentured and becoming landowners. The elite then began to wonder, what if this pattern continued? How much power will the poor landowner class gain if they continue to be a majority? So the colonists, particularly the elite planters, began to look at other alternative forms of labor. The most profitable part of the British New World Empire in the 17th century lay in the Caribbean, where sugar production fueled the export market. The tiny island of Barbados was the jewel of the English West Indies. In the 1640s, Barbadian planters began to grow sugarcane with great success. Sugar production was expensive. It was only made possible by costly machinery and extensive slave labor. For slaves, work on a sugar plantation was a life sentence to brutal labor. Beginning in the 1640s, barbarian planters purchased thousands of slaves to work their plantations. By the 1700s, slaves constituted more than three-fourths of the island's population. Since slave men outnumbered slave women 2 to 1, few slaves could form families and have children. Therefore, planters had to continually purchase enslaved Africans. Moreover, African slavery added an extra dehumanizing factor that can clearly be represented in this primary source. Then we mark the slaves. We have butted in their breast or shoulder with a hot iron having the letter of the ship's name on it. I delivered alive at Barbados to the company's factors 372, which being sold came out at about 19 pounds per head, one with another. We can argue that the African slavery system that emerged in the southern colonies in the 17th century followed this pattern. The early settlers of what became South Carolina were immigrants for Barbados. The Barbadian immigrants brought their slaves with them. By 1700, slaves made up about one-half of the population of Carolina. The Carolinas experimented unsuccessfully to match their semi-tropical climate with profitable export crops of tobacco, cotton, indigo, and olives. By the mid-1690s, however, colonists took advantage of the knowledge of rice cultivation among their many African slaves to build rice plantations. As mentioned earlier, most inhabitants of the southern colonies of British North America live in the Chesapeake. By 1700, 1 out of 8 people in the region was a black person from Africa. By the end of the 17th century, the system of slavery made economic and political sense to planters because slaves never became free. The slave labor system also polarized Southern society along lines of race and status. Suddenly, all slaves were black and nearly all blacks were slaves. Almost all free people were white and all whites were free or only temporarily bound in indentured servitude. In contrast to slaves in Barbados, most slaves in the 17th century southern colonies had frequent and close contact with white people. Slavery resolved the political unrest caused by the servant labor system, as we saw during the Bacon's Rebellion, but it created new political problems. Race became an important factor in the region. Race followed the expansion of slavery across the Atlantic world. Skin color and race suddenly seemed fixed. Englishmen equated Africans with categorical blackness and blackness with sin. An English writer in 1695 wrote that a Negro will always be a Negro. Carry him to Greenland, feed him chalk, feed him and manage him never so many ways. More and more Europeans embrace the notions that Europeans and Africans were of distinct races. Others now preach to the Old Testament, saying that God cursed Ham, the son of Noah, and doomed black people to perpetual enslavement. We will continue to discuss race and slavery as we move forward. To recap the things you have learned on these Chapter 3 video lectures, the English and the Spanish had different motivations and approaches to colonization. Jamestown began as a trading venture like the Spanish, but later changed to an agricultural colony. British attitudes towards natives changed. Initially, the need for survival in Jamestown forced a trade relation with the natives, but the need for land changed that relation. The English developed ideas of racial inferiority to justify conquest of natives. In the southern colonies, we will see two colonial institutions emerge during the 17th century. The House of Burgesses, a representative government, and slavery.